The first time I saw her, she was kneeling in the dirt near the broken fence line of the camp, her hands trembling as she tried to gather a mess tin of watery rice from a dented pot. I remember thinking she looked too frail to have ever worn a uniform, let alone carried the burden of being called an enemy. The air smelled of rusted tin, medicine, and sweat, the scent that clung to captivity, but something in that moment was different, an undercurrent, a ripple of anticipation that moved through the guards and the prisoners alike. Word had spread through the compound that new soldiers were coming, American ones, and buried somewhere in those whispers was something no one dared to say out loud. Among them was a man with skin the color of burned mahogany, a man the women had never seen the likes of in all their years of duty, training, and surrender. I was stationed as an interpreter then, a liaison between two broken worlds, one that had surrendered with dignity bruised and one that had fought with the unbearable weight of justice, and when that black American soldier walked through the open gate of the camp, every sound in the world seemed to vanish. The women, once defiant teachers, nurses, and clerks drafted into service for the empire, froze in bewilderment. Their eyes, hollowed by malnutrition and fear, widened not in terror but in confusion, as if reality itself had flickered and changed color before them. The Japanese sun was glaring overhead, washing the camp in gold, but against that light his uniform looked unreal, his face unreadable yet human in a way their captors had not been. Someone gasped. Someone else began to whisper prayers, though to which God, none could tell. For a moment the war seemed to pause, suspended in the dust between their disbelief and his quiet, weary gaze. He had seen too much, the march through the Philippines, the bodies along the road, the men who died before their boots wore out, and now he was staring at women who had once served the flag of his fiercest enemy. I remember the commander stepping forward, announcing through me that their suffering would end, that they were no longer prisoners, but survivors. But the women didn't hear the words at first. Their attention stayed on the soldier, on his face, the contradiction of what they had been told during the war, that Americans were beasts, and that black soldiers were closer to ghosts. Yet there he was, a man, breathing, standing tall with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen the world burn and still kept his humanity intact. Later that evening, after the food had been distributed and the guards had loosened their vigilance, the women gathered in the makeshift yard beneath a torn flag they no longer saluted. They began to speak among themselves, quietly at first, then louder, their voices trembling but deliberate. I listened as they shaped their confusion into words, speeches of apology, curiosity, even admiration, each of them wrestling with what the sight of that man had awakened in them. One said she could not understand how the enemy could look at her with mercy after what had been done in her name. Another confessed she felt shame for the stories she had believed, stories that painted America as soulless, divided, monstrous. The soldier didn't respond. He simply stood there, head lowered, listening to the women unravel their disbelief like a scroll of forgotten truth. There was no translator needed, the essence of what was being said reached him in tone alone. I remember watching him then, his hands trembling slightly, his eyes glistening, not with anger, but with the exhaustion of someone carrying both memories and forgiveness. To the women, he had become something unfamiliar, a living contradiction, proof that even in the ugliest face of war, humanity could survive. For hours they continued, their words half speech, half confession, and I realized that this night would live longer than the banners or the treaties or the photographs. It was a moment when history lost its mask. The soldier left the camp at dawn, his boots silent against the earth. The women stood by the fence, their heads bowed, not out of fear anymore but in something resembling reverence. When he turned to look back one last time, the morning light caught his face, and the women, those wounded remnants of a vanquished empire, saw not vengeance but understanding. Later they would tell me they saw something divine in him, not the divinity of gods, but of men who endure without hate. Years later, when the wars became ink and the faces turned to dust, I still remembered how those women clung to that night. It began with disbelief, yes, but what emerged was something neither of our nations had foreseen, the moment an enemy became a mirror. And though I've told this story more times than I can count, I still feel that silence when I speak it, the silence of a world trying to remember what it felt like to be human again. The dawn crept through the cracked wooden slats of the barracks, casting long shadows over faces etched by hunger and uncertainty. I remember the silence before the sun had fully risen, a fragile quiet that felt heavier than any gunfire we had endured, and how it was shattered by the faint sound of footsteps approaching the gate. That morning, the camp seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew the world was about to change in a way none of us could yet understand. The black soldier who had entered the day before was an enigma wrapped in his own fatigue. I watched him move among the prisoners, his presence both unsettling and comforting, a symbol of the world beyond the barbed wire yet tethered by shared suffering. His name was Private James Thompson, a man of few words but deep eyes that held stories no one dared to ask about. The Japanese women, once proud members of an empire that had marched across oceans with relentless ambition, now gathered around him with a mixture of awe and confusion. They dared to approach, their voices tentative at first, bridging a chasm carved by years of war and prejudice. It was in those exchanges, impossible conversations held in broken English, sign language, and the universal language of shared pain, that the walls of hatred began to crumble. One woman, Yuki, spoke of her lost family, the home reduced to ashes by bombs dropped from planes painted with the stars and stripes. Another, Hannah, recounted the hunger that gnawed at her insides, the cold nights spent whispering prayers to gods who had been silent throughout the bloodshed. Private Thompson listened, never interrupting, his own experiences mirrored in the grief etched on their faces. The camp, once a place defined by fear and control, transformed into a fragile sanctuary of unexpected empathy. Rumors spread among the prisoners that Thompson was not only brave but kind, that he had saved lives during battles in the Pacific jungles, risking everything to carry wounded comrades to safety. The women began to see him not as an enemy soldier but as a man, scarred and weary, fighting against a world that had rejected him because of the color of his skin. Their speeches, once hesitant and fragmented, grew bolder. They spoke of unity beyond nationality and race, of a hope that dappled the darkness like early morning light. I remember transcribing their words, words filled with longing, regret, and an aching desire for a peace they had never dared to imagine. Yet, beneath these fragile connections lay the harsh reality of ongoing conflict. The guards remained watchful, their cold eyes mistrusting the developing camaraderie. The war was not over. Battles raged far beyond the camp's perimeter, and the prisoners' new liberation was uncertain. But within those wire fences, history was quietly being rewritten, not by generals or treaties, but by the simple human act of reaching across a divide. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Yuki stood before the group to deliver a speech she had spent days preparing. Her voice trembled but did not falter as she spoke of prejudice and pain, of the blindness that war forced upon hearts and minds. She spoke of the black soldier who had seen her not as a foe, but as a sister in suffering. The women responded with applause, their faces alight with tears and newfound strength. That concert of voices was an anthem of hope in a world frayed by conflict, a promise that even in the darkest chapters, humanity could flicker and endure. I stood at the edge, feeling the weight of that moment settle into my bones, knowing this story belonged not just to those who lived it, but to all who would one day seek to understand the true cost of war and the unexpected bridges it could build. One particular evening, under a moon veiled by drifting clouds, the atmosphere thickened with something unspoken yet tangible. The women gathered around Thompson and his comrades from the 24th Infantry Regiment, an all-black unit whose valor had been tested on some of the most brutal battlefields in the Pacific. These men had fought not only a foreign enemy but systemic racism back home, and here, in the shattered remnants of Japan's empire, they stood as reluctant emissaries of freedom and equality. The speeches the women offered that night were laced with a complexity born of realizing that those they had been taught to hate were themselves victims of prejudice. They spoke of the paradox witnessed, the black American soldier bearing the same scars of discrimination that they had faced in their own patriarchal society, yet offering mercy and humanity. Their words wove through despair and admiration, remorse and recognition. One woman, her voice cracking with emotion, recited a speech that became a prayer for the souls lost to hate and ignorance, for the children who would never know the taste of peace born from understanding. The men listened quietly, some lowering their heads in humility, others with fierce pride at being seen as more than mere soldiers, but as men capable of changing tides not with bullets, but with compassion. In those guarded moments, the camp became more than a prison, it was a stage for healing and testimony, a crucible in which the raw elements of race, war, and identity were smelted toward a fragile hope. The transformation and the speeches reached even the watchful eyes of the occupying officers. Despite the rigid hierarchy and tension, an unspoken respect grew for the dignity both the prisoners and the black soldiers displayed. It was a delicate dance of power and vulnerability. Private Thompson began to teach the women simple English phrases, while they shared with him their language, their culture, their fears and dreams long suppressed by years of conflict. The speeches became lessons, a collective syllable of forgiveness and courage, and a subtle revolt against the dehumanization each had endured. Word of these encounters spread quietly beyond the barbed wire, seeping into the narratives of soldiers and liberators alike, challenging stereotypes and prejudices held by men from both sides. The women's speeches, carried like fragile embers, ignited conversations about race, honor, and what it truly meant to be human in a time set apart by cruelty and division. The days that followed brought a delicate yet profound transformation in the camp's atmosphere, a quiet reshaping of reality and expectations. Private James Thompson, though an enigma to many, became the axis around which fractured worlds began to turn. Unlike any soldier these Japanese women had ever known, he was not a faceless enemy. He was a man who carried the visible and invisible scars of both war and racial prejudice, fighting not just for victory but for recognition of a dignity denied to him even in his own land. At first, the women spoke hesitantly, struggling with the taboo of interacting with an American soldier who looked unlike the others, who defied all the propaganda they'd been fed about the enemy's race and character. But those whispers blossomed into speeches, heartfelt and raw, in which they spoke of suffering inflicted and endured, seeking understanding in a world irreparably broken by war. They shared their own stories, of loss, forced conscription, and the bitterness of survival under a collapsing empire. Their voices echoed their cultural conditioning and the shame they carried for surrendering, a betrayal so profound it threatened to shatter their very souls. Yet, in the presence of Thompson, these narratives tangled and unraveled, confronting truths about humanity that transcended borders, prejudice, and enmity. And Thompson listened, truly listened, his silent presence a balm and a challenge, a reminder that the enemy was not always the stranger but often the mirror. Later, In the makeshift assembly beneath the tattered remnants of their banners, the women delivered speeches not just as captives but as survivors and witnesses. They questioned the meaning of honor in war, the cost of obedience, and the possibility of reconciliation. Their words, carried in hesitant Japanese and broken English, reached across the gulf of pain and suspicion planted by years of conflict and seed the fragile roots of a new understanding. The speeches stood as reluctant admissions, a mixture of apology, defiance, and hope. They spoke of seeing black skin for the first time, not as the demonized other, but as flesh and blood, courage and kindness, a revelation that slowly began to dispel the shadows of fear with the light of empathy. As night fell outside the barbed wire, the camp hummed with a new kind of life, the quiet murmur of shared stories, the tentative exchange of trust, and the soft chorus of voices daring to dream beyond captivity. Months later, when the camp gates finally opened to freedom's uncertain light, those speeches reverberated in the hearts of many. The women stepped out no longer solely as prisoners but as witnesses to a story untold, the story of how first encounters, born of fear and suspicion, transformed into a testament of empathy and connection. After the war, some women would return to devastated homes, others to displaced lives, but all carried the memory of the Black American soldier whose presence challenged everything they had been taught. Their speeches survived as legacy, testimony to the human capacity to recognize kinship beyond skin, beyond national flags, beyond the bitterness of war. These voices would inspire future generations, reminding the world that even in captivity's darkest days, light can break through when we dare to stand face to face, speak our truths, and listen with open hearts. Now, decades after that final dawn and the soldiers' march home, the echo of those speeches lingers still. I have told this story often, and in every telling I am reminded of the fragile threads that held together those moments, the courage of women who saw beyond their plight, the dignity of men who bore the weight of both war and discrimination, and the silent language of humanity spoken between them. Their stories invite us to remember the cost of hatred, but also the redemptive power of empathy, the belief that even amid the horrors of war, the human spirit can find a way to heal, to connect, and to hope. So, when you think of those Japanese female prisoners of war and the Black American soldier who entered their world, remember not just the war behind them, but the future they dared to imagine, one speech at a time.